You're done when we get home. The words sliced through the elegant restaurant's gentle hum like a blade through silk. Sophia's fork freezes halfway to her mouth. The expensive pasta suddenly tasteless as Derek leans closer, his voice a whisper that somehow carries more menace than any shout ever could. His fingers dig into her wrist beneath the white tablecloth where no one can see, and she knows with absolute certainty that tonight will be different. Tonight will be worse. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you realized too late that the person you trusted most had become your greatest threat? Whether you're watching this from New York, Texas, or anywhere else, you probably know that sinking feeling when you recognize danger but feel powerless to escape it. 3 months ago, Sophia Reeves had thought Derek Castellano was everything she'd been looking for. At 24, she'd been working double shifts at the downtown marketing firm, living in a studio apartment that cost half her salary, and wondering if she'd ever find someone who saw her as more than just another face in the crowd. Derek had been charming, persistent, and seemingly successful with his real estate development company. He'd pursued her with expensive dinners, thoughtful gifts, and the kind of attention that had made her feel special for the first time in years. She should have recognized the signs earlier. The way he questioned her friendships until she stopped making plans with other people. How he'd grown critical of her appearance, her job performance, her family, always couched in concern for her well-being. The gradual erosion of her confidence had been so subtle that she'd barely noticed it happening, like water wearing away stone. By the time she realized what was happening, she'd been isolated, dependent, and convinced that his jealousy and control were evidence of how much he cared. Tonight was supposed to be special. Derek had made reservations at Bella Vista, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, claiming he wanted to celebrate their 3-month anniversary. The dining room was all warm lighting and soft classical music, filled with couples speaking in intimate murmurs and the gentle clink of expensive crystal. Sophia had worn her best dress, a simple black number that had cost her a week's grocery money, and had actually allowed herself to hope that maybe things between them could go back to how they'd been in the beginning. That hope had died the moment their waiter, a young man probably fresh out of college, had smiled at her while taking their order. "Thank you," she'd said, returning his polite smile automatically. Derek's face had darkened instantly, his jaw tightening in the way that had become increasingly familiar over the past month. The waiter had moved on to other tables, completely unaware that his simple friendliness had just signed Sophia's death warrant for later that evening. Derek had spent the next hour systematically destroying her confidence with surgical precision. Her dress was too tight, drawing attention she shouldn't want. Her laugh was too loud, embarrassing him in front of the other diners. She was flirting, disrespecting him, making him look like a fool. Each criticism had been delivered quietly, with a smile, so that anyone watching would see a couple having an intimate conversation rather than a man methodically tearing down the woman across from him. The final straw had come when she'd accidentally knocked over her water glass while reaching for her purse. It wasn't even a big spill, barely dampening the edge of the tablecloth, but Derek's reaction had been swift and vicious. His hand had shot across the table to grab her wrist, his smile never wavering as he delivered his threat. "You're done when we get home." She knew what that meant. The last time he'd said those words, she'd worn concealer for a week to hide the bruises on her arms. The time before that, he'd locked her in the bathroom for 6 hours, claiming she needed time to think about her behavior. Each punishment had grown more severe, more creative, and she'd learned to recognize the signs that preceded them. Sophia forced herself to take a shaky breath, her mind racing through possibilities. She could excuse herself to the bathroom and call her sister, but Derek had taken her phone earlier, claiming he wanted her full attention tonight. She could ask someone for help, but what would she say? That her boyfriend was angry at her? That he'd threatened her with consequences at home? It would sound ridiculous, and Derek was skilled at appearing completely reasonable to outsiders. 2 tables away, a man sat alone with his back to the wall, positioned so that he could see the entire restaurant. Leonardo Torino had initially planned to enjoy a quiet dinner, a rare moment of solitude in his carefully controlled world. At 33, he'd built an empire that commanded respect throughout the city, his legitimate security business serving as the public face of more complex operations that most people preferred not to know about. He was used to observing his surroundings, cataloging potential threats and escape routes out of habit, But tonight his attention had been caught by something else entirely. The young woman at the nearby table was beautiful in an understated way, with shoulder-length auburn hair and expressive brown eyes that reminded him of warm chocolate. But it wasn't her appearance that had captured his focus. It was the fear he recognized in her posture, the careful way she held herself as if preparing for a blow, the practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Leo had grown up in a world where violence was often hidden behind polite facades. He'd learned to read the subtle signs of predators and their prey, and every instinct he possessed was currently screaming that he was watching a hunting ground in action. The man across from her was handsome enough, well-dressed, and apparently successful, but Leo could see the calculation behind his smile, the way his hand moved to control and intimidate rather than comfort. When the woman knocked over her water glass, Leo watched the man's reaction with growing anger. The quick grab, the barely perceptible tightening of fingers, the whispered words that made her face go pale. Leo had seen enough domestic situations in his line of work to recognize the dynamics at play, and something protective and dangerous stirred in his chest. He'd built his reputation on knowing when to act and when to observe, but everything about this situation demanded action. The woman was clearly trapped, isolated, and in immediate danger. The man was escalating, moving beyond psychological manipulation into physical intimidation in a public space, which meant whatever happened when they got home would be significantly worse. Leo caught the attention of Marcus, his head of security, who was seated at the bar appearing to enjoy a casual drink while actually monitoring the restaurant for potential threats. A subtle hand signal conveyed his intentions, and Marcus's almost imperceptible nod confirmed understanding. If Leo chose to intervene, backup would be ready. The decision crystallized when Derek stood abruptly, his hand closing around Sophia's upper arm with enough force to make her wince. "Time to go," he said loudly enough for nearby diners to hear, his tone suggesting they were simply ending a lovely evening rather than beginning what Leo suspected would be a nightmare. Sophia rose unsteadily, her face carefully blank in a way that spoke of extensive practice hiding pain and fear. She gathered her purse with hands that trembled slightly, and Leo saw her glance desperately around the restaurant, as if searching for salvation she knew wouldn't come. That was when Leonardo Torino made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He stood smoothly, straightening his expensive suit jacket, and began walking directly toward their table. He'd built his career on calculated risks and protective instincts, and every fiber of his being demanded that he put himself between this woman and whatever waited for her at home. Derek was already guiding Sophia toward the exit, his hand still gripping her arm possessively, when Leo intercepted their path with the kind of casual confidence that came from years of commanding dangerous situations. The moment had arrived for him to discover whether his instincts about her danger were correct, and whether she would accept the protection he was prepared to offer. "Excuse me." Leo's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people stop and pay attention, even in crisis moments. Derek froze near the restaurant's entrance, his grip on Sophia's arm tightening reflexively as he turned to face the interruption. Sophia felt a flutter of hope mixed with terror. Someone had noticed, but that might only make things worse when they got home. "I believe the lady dropped this," Leo continued smoothly, holding up an expensive-looking earring that Sophia was fairly certain wasn't hers. He approached them with the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his Italian leather shoes making soft sounds against the marble floor. Derek's face shifted through several expressions before settling on forced politeness. "She didn't drop anything," he said curtly, his businessman smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We're leaving." Leo stepped closer, and Sophia caught the scent of his cologne, something understated and masculine that seemed to wrap around her like a promise of safety. He was taller than Derek, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit obviously custom-tailored, and when his green-gray eyes met hers, she saw something that had been missing from her life for months: genuine concern. "Are you certain?" Leo's gaze flickered meaningfully to the earring, then back to Sophia. "It was right by your table. Perhaps you should check before you go." The suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline, and Sophia realized he was offering her an excuse to delay, to break Derek's momentum toward whatever waited at home. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she considered taking it. "She's fine," Derek snapped, his mask of civility starting to slip. His fingers dug deeper into her arm, and she had to bite back a gasp of pain. "We really need to go?" "Actually," Leo said, his tone remaining conversational despite the steel that had entered his voice, "I think the lady can speak for herself." The simple statement hit like a thunderbolt. When was the last time someone had suggested she could speak for herself? When had anyone implied that her opinion mattered more than Derek's control? Sophia felt something long dormant stir within her, a tiny flame of defiance that Derek had been systematically smothering. "I should check," she said quietly, the words feeling foreign and dangerous on her tongue. Derek's head whipped toward her, his eyes promising retribution, but she kept talking. "It might be mine." Derek's grip became painful enough that she couldn't hide her wince. "It's not yours," he said firmly. "We're leaving. Now." That was when Leo's entire demeanor shifted. The polite stranger disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated controlled danger. He moved with fluid grace, placing himself between Derek and the exit with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. "I don't think she wants to go with you," Leo said quietly, and something in his voice made the nearby valet attendants take notice. "Remove your hand from her arm." Derek's face flushed red. "Who the hell do you think you are? This is none of your business." Leo tilted his head slightly, and Sophia caught a glimpse of what lay beneath his civilized exterior. "When someone is being hurt in my presence, it becomes my business." "I'm not hurting anyone," Derek protested, but his voice had risen, drawing attention from other restaurant patrons who were beginning to filter outside. "She's my girlfriend. We're having a private conversation." "Private conversations don't typically involve bruising someone's arm," Leo observed, his gaze dropping pointedly to where Derek's fingers were still wrapped around Sophia's bicep with visible force. Sophia felt the weight of multiple stares and realized that this confrontation had moved beyond anything she could contain or minimize. Derek's careful public image was cracking, revealing the anger and possessiveness he usually kept hidden until they were alone. "Let go of her," Leo repeated, and this time his words carried the unmistakable tone of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Derek's response was swift and telling. Instead of releasing her, he jerked Sophia closer to his side, his other hand moving to her waist in a grip that was purely possessive. "She's coming with me," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of reasonableness. "No, she's not." The voice that spoke wasn't Leo's. It was her own, barely above a whisper, but audible in the sudden silence that had fallen around them. Sophia was as shocked as anyone to hear the words emerge from her throat, but something about Leo's presence, his willingness to see her as a person worthy of protection, had awakened something she'd thought Derek had killed completely. Derek's grip became painful enough to make her cry out softly, and that was apparently all Leo needed. He moved with startling speed for a man his size, his hand closing over Derek's wrist with enough pressure to make the younger man gasp and immediately release Sophia. The restaurant's security team, who had been watching the developing situation with growing concern, moved closer. Sophia rubbed her arm where Derek's fingers had left red marks that were already beginning to darken into bruises, evidence of his control that would typically be hidden beneath long sleeves and careful makeup. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Derek said through gritted teeth, cradling his wrist. "She belongs to me." "No one belongs to anyone," Leo replied calmly. "And you're going to walk away now, before this becomes a situation you can't control." For a moment, Sophia thought Derek might actually try to escalate the confrontation physically. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation at being challenged publicly, at losing control of the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. But even in his fury, he seemed to recognize that Leo represented a different class of threat than the defenseless woman he was used to intimidating. "This isn't over," Derek said finally, his voice low and venomous as he focused on Sophia. "You think he's going to save you? You think any of this matters? You'll come back. They always do." The words hit like physical blows, carrying the weight of psychological manipulation that had been building for months. But before Sophia could respond, before the familiar shame and self-doubt could take hold, Leo stepped forward again. "Yes, it is over," Leo said with quiet finality. "And if you approach her again, if you contact her in any way, you'll discover exactly how permanent over can be. There was something in his tone that made Derek's face go pale beneath his anger. Whatever he heard in Leo's voice convinced him that this was not a man who made empty threats. He looked between Leo and Sophia one final time, his expression promising that this humiliation would not be forgotten or forgiven. "You'll regret this," he said finally, though it was unclear whether he was addressing Leo or Sophia. Then he turned and stalked toward the valet stand, his departure lacking any grace or dignity. Sophia stood frozen in the aftermath, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Someone had intervened. Someone had seen Derek's behavior for what it was and refused to allow it to continue. The relief was so overwhelming that she felt dizzy, but it was quickly followed by a crushing wave of terror. "He'll kill me," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "When he gets me alone, he'll kill me for this." Leo turned his full attention to her, and she saw understanding in his eyes that went beyond sympathy. He knew exactly what kind of danger she was in. "No, he won't," Leo said quietly, and something in his voice made her believe him. "Because you're not going to be alone with him again." "I don't understand," Sophia said, though part of her was already beginning to hope, despite everything Derek had taught her about the futility of hope. "My name is Leonardo Torino," Leo said, his voice gentle despite the steel that still ran through it. "I own a security company, and I have resources that can keep you safe. But we need to move quickly. I can't just disappear," she protested weakly, though the idea was intoxicating. "I have a job, an apartment, responsibilities." "Do you have family? Friends he might target to get to you?" The question hit like ice water. Her sister Lily, only 22 and still finishing college. Her parents, retired and living quietly in the suburbs. Derek knew about all of them, had met them, had carefully cultivated their trust and approval. "Oh God," she breathed, the full scope of her situation finally becoming clear. "He won't just come after me." "No," Leo agreed grimly. "Men like him escalate when they lose control. But men like me specialize in stopping them." Sophia looked up at this stranger who had appeared in her life like some kind of guardian angel, and realized she was facing the most important decision she'd ever made. Trust him and potentially escape Derek's control, or refuse his help and face whatever punishment awaited her for tonight's defiance. The choice, when she really examined it, wasn't much of a choice at all. Sophia woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar luxury surrounding her. The guest bedroom in Leo's penthouse was larger than her entire studio apartment, decorated in warm neutrals with furniture that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. For a few blissful seconds, she forgot where she was and why she was there. Then reality crashed back with devastating clarity. She was hiding from her boyfriend in a stranger's home because she'd finally admitted that Derek was dangerous. The night before felt surreal in the morning light. Leo had brought her here after collecting some essentials from her apartment, his security team efficiently sweeping her building while she packed a bag with shaking hands. He'd been nothing but professional and courteous, showing her to the guest room, explaining the security systems, and promising that someone would be watching over her at all times. She'd expected to lie awake all night, terrified and overthinking her decision to trust him. Instead, she'd slept better than she had in weeks, her body finally allowing itself to relax in a space where Derek couldn't reach her. Now, in the harsh light of day, she was questioning everything. What kind of man had the resources to provide this level of security on a moment's notice? What kind of life was she stepping into, and what would be expected of her in return? The smell of coffee and something delicious cooking drifted under her door, along with the low murmur of voices. Leo was awake, probably conducting business while she hid in his guest room like some kind of refugee. The thought made her stomach churn with embarrassment and uncertainty. She forced herself to get dressed in yesterday's clothes, wishing she'd had the presence of mind to pack more practically. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who looked haunted and fragile, with purple shadows under her eyes and Derek's fingerprints still visible on her arm. She looked exactly like what she was, a victim. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, she found Leo in the kitchen, dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater that emphasized his broad shoulders. He looked relaxed and domestic, nothing like the controlled, dangerous man who had faced down Derek the night before. The contradiction was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. "Good morning," he said, glancing up from the stove where he was making what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I made a little of everything." The kitchen island was set with fresh fruit, pastries, eggs prepared 3 different ways, and bacon that smelled like heaven. It was more food than Sophia typically ate in 2 days, prepared with obvious care and attention to detail. When was the last time someone had cooked for her? When had anyone anticipated her needs before she'd even expressed them? "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly, overwhelmed by the simple kindness. "I like cooking," Leo replied easily, pouring her a cup of coffee that smelled rich and complex. "It relaxes me." "Cream and sugar?" She nodded, still struggling to process the domesticity of the moment. Derek had never cooked for her, had barely acknowledged her presence in the morning beyond demanding breakfast and critiquing her appearance. This felt like stepping into someone else's life, someone who deserved care and consideration. Leo handed her the coffee prepared exactly how she liked it, though she was certain she'd never told him her preferences. The first sip was perfect, and she had to blink back tears at such a small gesture of thoughtfulness. "I need to call my work," she said suddenly, reality intruding on the peaceful moment. "I'm supposed to be there in an hour." "Already handled," Leo said calmly, sliding a plate of food toward her. "I had someone call in sick for you. You're taking a few personal days while we figure out the security situation. You can't just make decisions for me," Sophia said, though the protest lacked conviction. Part of her was grateful that someone else was handling the logistics of her life, even as another part insisted she should maintain some independence. "You're right," Leo acknowledged, settling across from her with his own coffee. "I should have asked first. But Derek showed up at your building at 6 this morning, and he's been calling your office every hour since 7. Taking a few days away from your normal routine gives us time to assess his pattern and plan accordingly." The food turned to ash in her mouth. Of course Derek hadn't given up. She'd been naive to think one public confrontation would deter him. "What did he want at my apartment?" "To get inside," Leo said grimly. "He told the building manager he was your boyfriend and you'd asked him to pick up some things. Fortunately, your security deposit included changing the locks yesterday evening." Sophia set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. The implications of Derek's behavior were terrifying. He was escalating exactly as Leo had predicted, becoming more aggressive and desperate as he lost control of the situation. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I should never have let you interfere. Now he's going to make everyone's life miserable." Leo reached across the island and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and reassuring. His hands were larger than Derek's, with calluses that spoke of work more substantial than shuffling papers in an office. She found herself wondering what those hands had done, what kind of life had shaped them. "This is not your fault," Leo said firmly. "Derek was always going to escalate. Men like him don't just let go when they lose control. At least now he's doing it in the open where people can see his true nature." "What exactly is your business?" Sophia asked, studying his face for tells. "Last night you said you owned a security company." "I do. Torino Security provides protection services for high-profile clients who have reason to fear for their safety. We also consult on personal security systems and threat assessment." It sounded legitimate, even impressive, but there was something in the way he said it, a careful precision that suggested there were layers he wasn't revealing. "And the other part?" she asked quietly. Leo's eyes sharpened, and she caught a glimpse of the man who had made Derek back down with just his presence. "What other part?" "You have resources that most security companies don't have. Last night, you moved like someone who's used to dangerous situations, and Derek was afraid of you in a way that went beyond professional intimidation." For a long moment, Leo was silent, clearly weighing how much truth she could handle. Finally, he spoke carefully. "My family has been involved in various business ventures for several generations. Some of those ventures exist in gray areas of the law. I've tried to keep my own operations legitimate, but in this city, complete separation isn't always possible." It was an honest answer without being a complete one, and Sophia found herself appreciating his discretion. She'd suspected there was more to his story, but she wasn't sure she was ready for full disclosure. The important thing was that he'd been honest about the complexity of his situation. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Because you recognize what Derek is?" Leo's expression softened, becoming something warmer and more personal. I helped you because I couldn't watch someone hurt you and do nothing about it. Everything else is just logistics. The simple honesty of his answer hit her harder than any elaborate explanation would have. For months, Derek had convinced her that no one would care about her welfare, that her pain and fear were of no consequence to anyone. Leo's matter-of-fact concern was like sunlight after months of living in shadows. They spent the rest of the morning in comfortable domestic routine that felt both foreign and natural. Leo showed her the security features of the penthouse, introduced her to Marcus, his head of security, and explained the protocols for leaving the building safely. Everything was handled with professional efficiency, but underlying it all was a gentleness that made her feel protected rather than imprisoned. The difference between Derek's control and Leo's protection was becoming clearer with each hour. Derek's restrictions had been about isolating her, making her dependent and afraid. Leo's security measures were about keeping her safe while maintaining her autonomy. He asked for her input, explained his reasoning, and made it clear that she could leave whenever she chose to. That afternoon, while Leo handled business calls from his home office, Sophia found herself exploring the penthouse and thinking about her situation. The space was beautiful but lived in, filled with books and artwork that suggested genuine interests rather than designer staging. She could see herself being comfortable here, which was a dangerous thought for someone who'd known this man for less than 24 hours. The ringing phone interrupted her wandering thoughts. Leo's voice carried from the office, professional but with an edge of anger that made her pay attention. "Yes, I understand he's persistent," Leo was saying. "No, she's not taking his calls. Make sure building security knows he's not to be admitted under any circumstances." Derek was still trying to reach her, still refusing to accept that she'd removed herself from his control. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in months, someone else was handling Derek's manipulation and intimidation. She didn't have to manage his emotions or anticipate his reactions. She could simply exist without constantly calculating how to avoid his displeasure. That evening, they shared dinner on the penthouse terrace as the city lights began to twinkle below them. Leo had insisted on cooking again, claiming it helped him think, and the meal was another masterpiece of careful attention to her preferences. "This is incredible," Sophia said, gesturing to the perfectly prepared salmon and the view of the city skyline. "I feel like I'm living in someone else's life." "What does your real life look like?" Leo asked, refilling her wine glass with something that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "Small," she said without thinking, then flushed at the admission. "I mean, quiet. Simple. I work, I go home, I try not to make waves." "That's not living," Leo observed gently. "That's surviving." The distinction hit her like a physical blow. When had surviving become her highest aspiration? When had she stopped believing she deserved more than just making it through each day without triggering Derek's anger? "I used to have dreams," she said softly, surprised to hear herself admitting it. "I wanted to start my own marketing consultancy. I had plans, savings, goals. But Derek said it was unrealistic, that I needed to be more practical." "What Derek said was designed to keep you small and dependent," Leo said, his voice carrying quiet fury that wasn't directed at her. "Men like him are threatened by their partner's success because it represents independence they can't control." The conversation continued long into the evening, moving from her lost dreams to his own complicated relationship with family expectations and business pressures. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, talking freely without constantly monitoring her words for potential offense. It was nearly midnight when they finally moved inside, both reluctant to end the connection that had been building between them all day. Sophia was hyper-aware of Leo's presence as they moved through the dimly lit penthouse, conscious of his height and strength and the way his attention seemed focused entirely on her. They paused in the hallway between their rooms, the space suddenly charged with an energy that had nothing to do with security arrangements or Derek's threats. Leo's eyes had darkened, and when his gaze dropped to her lips, she felt her breath catch. "Sophia," he said softly, her name carrying weight and promise in his voice. She stepped closer, drawn by something that felt inevitable, and saw his pupils dilate in response. The air between them hummed with possibility, with the acknowledgement of attraction that had been building since the moment he'd stepped into her life. Leo's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking gently across her skin, and she leaned into the touch with a small sound of need. She wanted this, wanted him, in a way that felt entirely separate from gratitude or circumstance. His phone buzzed sharply against his hip, shattering the moment like glass. Leo closed his eyes briefly, clearly fighting the urge to ignore the interruption, before stepping back with visible reluctance. "I'm sorry," he said, checking the message. "It's Marcus. We have a situation." The spell broken, Sophia wrapped her arms around herself and nodded understanding. Reality was intruding again, reminding them both that this sanctuary existed in the shadow of very real danger. But as Leo moved to handle whatever crisis had developed, she touched her cheek where his hand had been and knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had proven that what was growing between them was more than just circumstance and protection. It was the beginning of something that might actually be worth the risk. The security alarm pierced through Sophia's dreams at 3 a.m, jerking her awake with her heart already racing. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in her studio apartment, that Derek had finally made good on his threats to force his way inside. Then Leo's voice cut through the chaos, calm and authoritative as he spoke into his phone from the hallway. "Marcus, what's the status?" she heard him say, followed by a string of technical terms she didn't understand. "Yes, I want every camera angle." "No, don't engage directly. Document everything and coordinate with building security." Sophia sat up in bed, her silk pajamas clinging to skin that had gone cold with fear. The penthouse's security system was sophisticated enough to monitor her old apartment building, which could only mean one thing. Derek had escalated again. Leo appeared in her doorway moments later, his hair mussed from sleep, wearing only pajama pants that sat low on his hips. Even in crisis mode, she couldn't help but notice the breadth of his shoulders, the defined muscles of his chest and arms that spoke of regular training rather than vanity workouts. "Are you okay?" he asked, crossing to sit on the edge of her bed without invitation. His presence was immediately comforting, solid and warm in the face of whatever new threat Derek had presented. "What happened?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. "Derek broke into your apartment building. He managed to get past the front desk security around 2:30 and made it to your floor before the upgraded surveillance we installed caught him trying to pick your lock." Sophia's blood turned to ice. The thought of Derek in her space, touching her belongings, searching for clues about where she'd gone, made her feel violated in ways she couldn't articulate. That apartment had been her sanctuary before it became her prison, and now he'd contaminated even that refuge. "Did he get inside?" she asked, dreading the answer. "No. The new locks held, and building security responded within minutes. But Sophia, he had tools. Professional lock picks, a small crowbar, duct tape. This wasn't impulsive anger. He came prepared to take you by force if you'd been there." The implications of Leo's words hit her like physical blows. Derek hadn't just been trying to reclaim what he considered his property. He'd been planning something far more sinister, something that required restraints and the ability to muffle sound. The duct tape detail made her stomach lurch with terror at what he'd intended to do to her. "Oh God," she breathed, her hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. Oh God, he was going to." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the violence that Derek had been prepared to inflict. The months of psychological manipulation suddenly seemed like gentle preparation for whatever physical harm he'd been working toward. She'd escaped just in time, and the realization of how close she'd come to something unthinkable sent her spiraling into panic. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her vision tunneling as her body finally processed the full extent of the danger she'd been living with. Derek hadn't just been controlling and manipulative. He'd been planning to hurt her, possibly kill her, and she'd been so conditioned to minimize his behavior that she'd nearly walked willingly into his trap. "Sophia, breathe," Leo said urgently, moving closer as she began hyperventilating. "You're safe. He can't reach you here. Look at me." But she couldn't look at him, couldn't focus on anything except the crushing weight of her own stupidity. How had she not seen what Derek really was? How had she convinced herself that his jealousy and control were evidence of love rather than signs of a dangerous predator? How many red flags had she ignored, minimized, or explained away? "I'm so stupid," she gasped between ragged breaths. "I should have known. I should have seen what he was. Everyone probably knew except me. Hey, no, Leo said firmly, his hands coming up to frame her face and force her to meet his eyes. You're not stupid. You're a survivor who did what she had to do to stay safe in an impossible situation. But the panic had taken full hold now, months of suppressed fear and self-doubt pouring out in a torrent she couldn't control. Her chest felt tight, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would burst. She was dimly aware of making sounds, desperate gasping sobs that seemed to come from someone else's throat. Without hesitation, Leo pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling her head while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back. His skin was warm and solid beneath her cheek, his heartbeat steady and reassuring against the chaos of her own pulse. Breathe with me, he murmured into her hair. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. That's it. You're okay. You're safe. He guided her through breathing exercises with infinite patience, his voice a steady anchor while her nervous system slowly began to settle. She could smell his cologne mixed with soap and something uniquely masculine, could feel the careful strength of his arms around her, protective without being confining. Gradually, her breathing evened out and her vision cleared. She became aware that she was pressed against Leo's bare chest, her tears having left damp patches on his skin. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, but in a completely different way than her panic had been. I'm sorry, she whispered against his collarbone. I completely fell apart. You have nothing to apologize for, Leo said quietly, his fingers stroking gently through her hair. What you just experienced is a normal response to psychological trauma. Derek spent months conditioning you to doubt your own perceptions and minimize your instincts. Breaking that conditioning takes time. His understanding was almost more overwhelming than his comfort had been. When was the last time someone had seen her pain clearly, had validated her experience instead of suggesting she was overreacting? How do you know so much about this? She asked, pulling back slightly to look at his face. Leo's expression darkened, and she saw something raw and painful flicker across his features before he could hide it. Because I've seen what men like Derek do to people they claim to love. I've seen the aftermath when no one intervenes in time. There was a weight to his words that suggested personal experience, and Sophia found herself studying his face more carefully. There were scars she hadn't noticed before, faint lines around his eyes that spoke of violence and loss. Whatever had shaped Leo into the man who intervened to protect strangers, it had cost him something significant. What happened? She asked softly. For a long moment, Leo was silent, clearly debating whether to share whatever painful history her question had touched. Finally, he began to speak, his voice carefully controlled. When I was 15, my father brought home a woman named Isabella. She was young, maybe 25, and beautiful in a fragile way that made my mother immediately suspicious. My father claimed she was just a friend, someone who needed temporary help, but it became clear pretty quickly that the relationship was more complicated. Sophia settled more comfortably against his side, sensing that this story was important, that Leo rarely shared these details with anyone. Isabella had been involved with a man who beat her, terrorized her family, and threatened to kill her if she tried to leave. She'd finally found the courage to run, and my father was helping her disappear. For 6 months, she lived in our guest house while we tried to help her rebuild her life. Leo's arms tightened around Sophia almost imperceptibly, and she could feel the tension building in his muscles as he continued. Her ex found her anyway. He showed up one night when my father was out of town on business, when it was just me, my mother, and Isabella in the house. He had a gun, and he'd brought 2 friends for backup. They wanted Isabella, but when my mother tried to call for help, they decided no one could be left to identify them. Sophia's breath caught as she realized where this story was heading. The careful control in Leo's voice couldn't mask the pain that had never fully healed, the trauma that had shaped his entire adult life. I hid in the pantry while they killed my mother and Isabella, he continued quietly. I was 15 years old, and I listened to them die because I was too scared and weak to help them. Oh, Leo, Sophia whispered, her heart breaking for the boy who had witnessed something no child should ever see. The police found me 12 hours later when my father came home and discovered the bodies. The men were never caught. My father spent the next 10 years hunting them down one by one, and I learned that sometimes the only way to protect people is to be more dangerous than the ones who want to hurt them. The pieces of Leo's character suddenly clicked into place. His instinctive recognition of predators, his resources and connections in dangerous circles, his willingness to intervene for a stranger. He'd built his entire life around preventing what had happened to his mother and Isabella from happening to anyone else. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Because you saw Isabella in my situation?" "Partly," Leo admitted. "But also because the moment I saw Derek threatening you, I knew I couldn't live with myself if I walked away and something happened to you later." The honesty of his admission, combined with the vulnerability he'd just shared, created an intimacy between them that felt profound and transformative. Sophia realized that what was growing between them went far beyond gratitude or circumstance. They were two damaged people who had recognized something healing in each other. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, and saw his eyes darken in response. The attraction that had been building since the moment they met suddenly felt urgent and necessary, a life-affirming connection in the face of so much darkness and violence. "Leo," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for, but knowing she needed something from him that went beyond protection and comfort. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his cheek as he studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She could see the desire in his eyes, but also the careful restraint of a man who didn't want to take advantage of her vulnerability. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "You've been through trauma tonight, and I don't want you to do anything you might regret tomorrow." Instead of answering with words, she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as he responded. His lips were warm and firm, and when he kissed her back with careful tenderness, she felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower finally receiving sunlight. The kiss deepened gradually, becoming an exploration of possibility and promise rather than desperate passion. Leo's hand tangled gently in her hair, and she could feel the strength he was holding back, the desire he was tempering with consideration for her emotional state. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sophia felt fundamentally changed. The scared, isolated woman who had walked into Bella Vista restaurant 2 days ago was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to remember what it felt like to be valued and protected by choice rather than controlled by fear. "You're under my protection now," Leo said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "Permanently, if you'll let me." Before Sophia could respond, Leo's phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. He reached for it with obvious reluctance, and his expression darkened as he read the message. "What is it?" she asked, though the sudden tension in his body already told her it was bad news. "Derek just sent a message to my business line," Leo said grimly. "He knows you're with me, and he's threatening your family if you don't contact him within 24 hours. The warm cocoon of safety and intimacy shattered instantly, replaced by the cold reality that Derek's obsession had escalated beyond anything she'd imagined. He wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was targeting the people she loved most, the ones who had no protection against his violence. The war for her freedom was far from over, and Derek had just raised the stakes in ways that would test everything Leo had promised to protect. Within an hour of Derek's threat, Leo had mobilized a level of resources that left Sophia speechless. She sat at his kitchen island watching him coordinate protection details with the efficient precision of a military commander, speaking in rapid Italian to people who responded with immediate understanding and compliance. "Your parents will have a security detail starting now," Leo said, ending one call and immediately placing another. "Discreet surveillance, but comprehensive coverage. Your sister Lily is more complicated because of her college campus, but we have people who specialize in academic settings. How do you have this many people available on such short notice?" Sophia asked, still struggling to comprehend the scope of his operation. Leo paused in his coordination efforts, his green-gray eyes meeting hers with something that might have been regret. "Because this is what my family does, Sophia. We protect people who can't protect themselves, and we eliminate threats that law enforcement can't or won't handle." The careful phrasing told her everything she needed to know about the true nature of his business interests. Leo wasn't just connected to dangerous people. He was one of them, operating in spaces where violence was a tool and justice was administered outside legal channels. "Should I be afraid of you?" She asked quietly, though she realized she already knew the answer. Despite everything she'd learned about his capabilities, she'd never felt safer than she did in his presence. Not unless you try to hurt someone I care about, Leo replied with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And I care about you, Sophia. More than is probably wise given the circumstances. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them had planned to cross. Somewhere between the terror of Derek's escalation and the intimacy of shared vulnerability, gratitude had transformed into something deeper and more dangerous. I care about you too, she said softly, surprised by her own courage. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are. The way you cook breakfast like it's a gift. How you listen when I talk. The fact that you've turned your trauma into protection for other people instead of becoming like the men who hurt your family. Leo's expression shifted, becoming something raw and unguarded. No one had ever seen past his reputation and resources to recognize the choice he'd made to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than simply dominate. Sophia, he said quietly, stepping around the island to stand close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. His lips found hers with focused intensity, and she responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding up his chest to tangle in his hair. The kiss tasted of promise and possibility, of two people choosing each other despite the chaos surrounding them. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Leo's eyes had darkened with desire that was no longer carefully restrained. I want you, he said simply, his voice rough with honesty. But I need you to be certain this is what you want, not just adrenaline or gratitude. In response, she took his hand and led him toward his bedroom, her heart hammering with nervous excitement rather than fear. For the first time in months, physical intimacy felt like a choice she was making rather than an obligation she was fulfilling. Leo's bedroom was as carefully designed as the rest of his penthouse, but Sophia barely noticed the details. Her attention was focused entirely on the man beside her, on the careful way he touched her face, as if she were something precious that might shatter if handled roughly. Are you sure? He asked one final time, his thumb stroking across her cheekbone. Instead of answering with words, she began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was offering. This wasn't just physical intimacy, it was trust in its purest form, the decision to be completely vulnerable with someone who had the power to protect or destroy her. Leo's hands were gentle as he helped her out of her clothes, his touch reverent rather than possessive. When his lips followed the path of his fingers along her skin, she understood the difference between being taken and being cherished. Everything Derek had done to her had been about his needs, his desires, his control. This was about mutual giving, about pleasure shared rather than extracted. Their lovemaking was tender and thorough, punctuated by whispered endearments and gentle laughter when they fumbled in their eagerness to be closer. Leo was patient and attentive, ensuring her comfort and pleasure with the same focused dedication he applied to everything else in his life. When she finally cried out his name, it was with joy rather than the practiced performance Derek had demanded. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the gray light of dawn, her head resting on his chest as his fingers combed lazily through her hair. Sophia felt transformed, as if she'd finally remembered who she was beneath months of psychological conditioning. This changes everything, doesn't it? She said quietly, tracing lazy patterns on his chest. Only if you want it to, Leo replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I meant what I said about protecting you regardless, but what happens between us personally is your choice. I wanted to change everything, she admitted, surprising herself with her certainty. I think I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me more than Derek's threats. Leo's arms tightened around her, and she could feel his smile against her hair. Good, he said quietly, because I've been falling in love with you since the moment you found the courage to say no to him in that restaurant. They might have spent the entire morning lost in newfound intimacy, but Leo's phone shattered their peace with its urgent ringtone. He reached for it reluctantly, his expression darkening as he read the message. What is it? Sophia asked, though his sudden tension already told her the answer. Derek has your sister, Leo said grimly, showing her a photo that made her blood turn to ice. Lily was sitting in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, her hands bound, and her eyes wide with terror. The message below the image was simple and direct. Trade yourself for her by noon, or I start cutting pieces off. The bottom dropped out of Sophia's world. Her sweet, innocent sister who had nothing to do with any of this was now trapped because of her choices. Lily, who still called her every Sunday, who sent care packages during finals week, who had never hurt anyone in her 22 years of life. I have to go to him, Sophia said immediately, already moving to get dressed. I have to trade myself. Absolutely not, Leo said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Derek is escalating to his endgame. If you go to him now, he'll kill you both. Then what do you suggest? She demanded, fear making her voice sharp. That's my sister, Leo. My baby sister who has never done anything wrong in her life. We get her back, Leo said with deadly calm, his entire demeanor shifting from tender lover to lethal predator. But we do it my way, which means everyone comes home alive except Derek. Sophia watched him transform before her eyes, saw the careful civilization fall away to reveal the dangerous man beneath. This was who Leo really was when someone threatened what he protected, and it was both terrifying and reassuring. I want to be part of this, she said firmly. I'm not sitting here safe while you risk yourself for my family. Absolutely not, Leo repeated. You're staying here where I know you're protected. No, Sophia said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. Derek took my sister because of me, and I'm not hiding while other people clean up my mess. Either you include me in whatever you're planning, or I'll go to him myself. Leo's jaw clenched with frustration, clearly torn between his protective instincts and her right to make her own choices. She could see him struggling with the same conflict that had defined their entire relationship, the balance between protection and control. If I let you be part of this, you follow my orders exactly, he said finally. No heroics, no deviations from the plan, and no unnecessary risks. Agreed? Agreed, she said immediately, though they both knew she was lying. When it came to protecting her sister, there was no such thing as an unnecessary risk. Leo began making calls with military precision, coordinating resources and personnel for what was clearly a complex operation. As Sophia listened to him plan Lily's rescue, she realized she was seeing the true scope of his power for the first time. This wasn't just a successful businessman with some dangerous connections. This was someone who commanded an organization capable of waging war when necessary. Derek had made the mistake of escalating against a man who had built his entire life around preventing what had happened to his own family. He'd chosen the wrong woman to obsess over, and he was about to discover exactly what that mistake would cost him. As they prepared to leave for what would undoubtedly be the final confrontation, Sophia found herself thinking not about fear or danger, but about the man who had transformed her from victim to partner in less than 3 days. Whatever happened next, she would face it as someone who had remembered her own worth and strength. Derek had intended to destroy her. Instead, he'd led her directly to the person who would help her rebuild herself into someone stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. The abandoned warehouse in Queens looked exactly like every crime movie cliché, all broken windows and rusted metal siding that had seen better decades. Sophia crouched behind a shipping container 200 yards away, wearing tactical gear that Leo's team had provided and a communication device that kept her connected to the coordinated assault about to unfold. Remember, Derek expects you to come alone and terrified, Leo's voice said through her earpiece. Instead, you're going to walk in there as part of a team with backup he can't see. He's lost control of the situation. He just doesn't know it yet. Sophia checked her watch. 11:45. In 15 minutes, Derek expected her to surrender herself in exchange for Lily's life. Instead, he was about to discover that the frightened, isolated woman he'd been terrorizing no longer existed. Through her binoculars, she could see Lily tied to a chair near the warehouse's main entrance, exactly where Derek had positioned her to be visible from multiple angles. Her sister looked terrified but unharmed, which was the only thing keeping Sophia's fear from overwhelming her determination. Alpha team in position, Marcus reported through the radio. Sophia could see the shadowy figures moving along the warehouse's north side. Leo's security specialists who had handled situations far more complex than one obsessed ex-boyfriend with delusions of control. Bravo team ready, came another voice. The south entrance was covered by men who had been protecting people for far longer than Derek had been manipulating them. Leo himself was positioned to enter through the skylight once Sophia had Derek's full attention. The plan was surgical: isolate the threat, secure the victim, neutralize the danger. It would have been simpler to handle the entire operation without her involvement, but Sophia had insisted on being present for Derek's final defeat. She needed to see his face when he realized that she was no longer the powerless victim he'd been conditioning for months. She needed him to understand that his threats and manipulation had led her directly to someone stronger and more dangerous than he could ever hope to be. "Time," Leo said quietly through her earpiece. "Sophia, you're the strongest person I know. Show him who you really are." Taking a deep breath, Sophia stood and began walking toward the warehouse's main entrance. She moved with confidence rather than the desperate urgency Derek expected, her pace steady and purposeful. She was no longer approaching as a victim trying to save her sister. She was approaching as a woman backed by resources that Derek couldn't imagine, supported by a man who had made eliminating threats like him his life's work. Derek emerged from the shadows as she approached the entrance, his appearance shocking her with its deterioration. The polished businessman facade had completely crumbled, replaced by someone who looked desperate and unhinged. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held the wild gleam of a man whose carefully constructed reality was collapsing around him. "Sophia," Derek called out, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and vindication. "I knew you'd come. I knew you couldn't abandon your precious sister." "Let her go, Derek," Sophia replied calmly, stopping just outside the warehouse entrance. "This is between us." "Oh no," Derek said with a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "This stopped being just between us the moment you brought that man into our relationship. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? What you've destroyed?" Sophia studied his face and realized that Derek's obsession had progressed beyond anything resembling rational thought. He genuinely believed that she belonged to him, that her escape had been theft rather than liberation, that whatever he was about to do was justified by her betrayal. "I didn't destroy anything, Derek," she said quietly. "I simply stopped letting you control me." "Control you?" Derek's voice rose to nearly a shout. "I loved you. I provided for you. I protected you from making mistakes that would have ruined your life. You isolated me," Sophia corrected, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You criticized everything about me until I stopped believing I deserved better. You convinced me that your jealousy was love and your manipulation was care. But it wasn't love, Derek. It was ownership." Derek's face twisted with rage at her defiance, at her refusal to accept his version of their relationship. This was the moment he'd always feared, when his victim found her voice and refused to be silenced. "You think your Mafia boyfriend is going to save you?" Derek spat. "You think he actually cares about some broken little marketing assistant? You're just a project to him, a charity case he'll discard when he gets bored." The words were designed to trigger the insecurities Derek had spent months building, to make her doubt Leo's feelings and her own worth. But instead of the familiar stab of self-doubt, Sophia felt only pity for the man who understood so little about real love that he couldn't recognize it when he saw it. "Leo doesn't need to save me, Derek," she said calmly. "I saved myself the moment I stopped believing your lies about what I deserved." That was apparently the final straw for Derek's fragile control. He pulled a gun from his jacket, pointing it directly at her with hands that shook with fury and desperation. "You're coming with me," he said through gritted teeth. "Both of you. We're going to disappear somewhere I can fix what that man has done to your head." "No, Derek," Sophia said simply. "We're not." The single word of defiance seemed to break something fundamental in Derek's psyche. His face contorted with rage as he raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Sophia stared down the barrel and felt no fear, only profound sadness that Derek's inability to love had led them all to this moment. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, but Derek's weapon never fired. Leo had dropped through the skylight with perfect timing, his own weapon eliminating the threat before Derek could pull the trigger. The man who had terrorized her for months collapsed without ever understanding what had hit him. "Is everyone clear?" Leo's voice cut through the sudden silence as his team secured the warehouse. "Lily is safe," Marcus reported. "No injuries, just frightened." Sophia ran to where her sister sat tied to the chair, her hands shaking as she worked to free the bonds. Lily threw her arms around Sophia's neck the moment she was loose, both women crying with relief and residual terror. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered into her sister's hair. "I'm so sorry he dragged you into this." "You saved me," Lily said fiercely. "You and Leo saved me." Looking over her sister's shoulder, Sophia met Leo's eyes across the warehouse. He was checking Derek's body with professional efficiency, ensuring that the threat was permanently neutralized. But when their gazes connected, she saw nothing but relief and love. 3 months later, Sophia stood in the kitchen of Leo's penthouse preparing Sunday dinner for her family. The space that had once felt impossibly luxurious now felt like home, filled with laughter and the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Her parents had initially been concerned about her relationship with a man whose business interests existed in moral gray areas, but Leo's obvious devotion to their daughter and his courteous respect for their family had gradually won their acceptance. Lily had become particularly fond of him after he'd arranged for her college campus security to be upgraded following her ordeal. "You're burning the garlic," Leo observed, sliding his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a kiss to her neck. "I'm multitasking," Sophia replied, leaning back against his chest with a contentment that still sometimes surprised her. "Your mother called earlier. She wants to know if we've set a date yet." Leo's proposal had been perfect in its simplicity, offered during a quiet evening 3 weeks after Derek's death, when they'd been discussing their future with the casual certainty of people who had found their home in each other. The ring was elegant without being ostentatious, chosen because it reminded him of her eyes rather than because of its cost. "What did you tell her?" Leo asked, his lips finding the sensitive spot behind her ear that never failed to make her shiver. "That we're still deciding between spring and fall," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "But honestly, I think I prefer something simple. Just family and people who matter." Leo's smile was soft and private, meant only for her. "Whatever you want," he said simply. "I just want you to be my wife." The easy certainty of his statement still had the power to take her breath away. Sophia had spent so many months believing she didn't deserve love that sometimes she still marveled at the reality of being cherished by someone like Leo. Not because of his wealth or power, but because of the gentle strength he showed her every day, the way he supported her dreams while building new ones together. If you're wondering whether love can really heal the damage from toxic relationships, or if someone can truly change your life in just a few days, I hope my story gives you hope. Sometimes the right person appears exactly when you need them most, offering not just protection, but partnership in building something beautiful together. Her marketing consultancy was flourishing, supported by clients Leo had recommended and her own growing confidence in her abilities. She discovered that her experience with psychological manipulation had given her unique insights into consumer behavior, making her surprisingly effective at ethical advertising strategies. Derek's death had been ruled justifiable homicide after the police reviewed the surveillance footage Leo's team had provided. The kidnapping charge alone would have guaranteed life in prison. The attempted murder of Sophia had simply expedited a resolution that had become inevitable the moment Derek escalated to violence. The doorbell announced her family's arrival, and soon the penthouse filled with the warm chaos of Sunday dinner. Sophia watched Leo interact with her parents and sister, noting how naturally he'd been absorbed into their family dynamic. He was patient with her father's business questions, charmed by her mother's cooking advice, and genuinely interested in Lily's college experiences. This was what love looked like, she realized. Not the desperate possession Derek had mistaken for devotion, but the generous support of someone who wanted her to flourish rather than diminish. Leo protected her not by controlling her choices, but by ensuring she had the freedom and safety to make those choices authentically. As the evening wound down and her family prepared to leave, Lily pulled Sophia aside for a private moment. "He's good for you," her sister said quietly. "You look like yourself again. Actually, you look like a better version of yourself." "I feel like a better version of myself," Sophia admitted. "He doesn't try to change me or fix me. He just loves who I am and supports who I want to become." After her family left, Sophia and Leo cleaned the kitchen together in comfortable companionship, their movements synchronized after months of shared domestic life. When Leo pulled her into his arms for a slow dance to music only they could hear, she marveled at how perfect this simple moment felt. No regrets? Leo asked quietly, his forehead resting against hers. Only that I didn't meet you sooner, Sophia replied honestly. Though maybe I needed to go through everything with Derek to appreciate what real love looks like. Derek had intended to break her spirit and steal her future. Instead, his obsession had led her directly to a man who helped her rebuild herself stronger than before, who showed her that love meant partnership rather than possession, protection rather than control. As they swayed together in the golden light of their shared home, Sophia felt profound gratitude for the courage she'd found that night in the restaurant. For the moment, she'd finally said no to Derek's threat and yes to the possibility of something better. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads directly to the best thing. Sometimes the person who tries to destroy you actually delivers you to exactly where you need to be. Looking up at Leo's face, seeing nothing but love and promise in his green-gray eyes, Sophia knew she'd found her home not in a place, but in the heart of a man who understood that true strength meant protecting rather than conquering, loving rather than owning. Their future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibility and partnership, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care that could weather any storm. Derek had tried to teach her that she was powerless and unworthy of love. Leo had shown her that she was strong enough to save herself and deserving of a love that would last a lifetime. In the end, that made all the difference.